10 Thanksgiving Horror Stories. Story number 1, The Harvest Feast. The air outside was crisp, a cold November wind howling through the barren trees that surrounded the estate. The invitation had been clear, and despite the unsettling isolation of the place, they had come. The Hawthorne family, too many years apart, was about to gather again for the first Thanksgiving since old patriarch William Hawthorne's death. His estate, a sprawling manor set far from any town, had always been a place of mystery and quiet luxury, but it was the kind of place that made you wonder about the secrets it held. As they crossed the iron gates, all they could see was the cold, looming shape of the house, its windows staring out like dark eyes. Inside, the warmth of the hearth did little to ease the tension that hung in the air. The long dining table was set meticulously, the scent of roasted turkey, spiced apples, and baked pies filling the room. But there was something off about the feast. The familiar scents seemed too heavy, cloying, and the room felt as though it was holding its breath. As the last guests arrived, a chill ran through the hall, though no door had opened. "Welcome," said Gregory Hawthorne, the eldest son, his voice low and brittle, like dry leaves. "It's been too long." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something different about him, a hollowness that none of the family members could ignore. They all sat down, the table now fully occupied by William's surviving relatives, his children, grandchildren, and their respective spouses. The only empty chair was at the head of the table, where William had once sat. His presence was still felt, though. It lingered in the walls and corners of the room, like a shadow that wouldn't quite fade. A toast was made to the family's good health, to Thanksgiving, and to William's memory. But no one seemed to truly celebrate. Even as the plates were filled with food, there was an unease that none could shake. As they began to eat, the first signs of something wrong came in whispers, just out of the corner of their eyes. One by one, they felt it. A sensation that the house was not merely standing still, but breathing. The walls seemed to pulse as if alive, and the very air seemed thick with something ancient. At first, they brushed it off, thinking it was nothing more than the natural eerie atmosphere of a house so far from civilization. But as the night wore on, the temperature in the room dropped inexplicably. The shadows in the corners deepened, and the flames in the fireplace flickered as if struggling to stay alive. "Something's not right," whispered Clara, the youngest daughter, clutching her glass of wine tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a growing fear. She had always been sensitive to such things, an uncanny intuition that seemed to warn her when something was amiss. "You're imagining things," said her brother James, his voice betraying a nervous edge. But his hands trembled as he placed his fork down. He could feel it too, something watching, something hungry. It wasn't until the turkey was carved and passed around that the first death occurred. At the far end of the table, Aunt Marjorie, a woman who had never gotten along with the family, suddenly gasped. She clutched at her throat, her face turning a deep shade of purple, as if choking on the very air itself. But there was no turkey stuck in her throat. She fell forward, her body convulsing violently before going still. Panic spread like wildfire. The room erupted in chaos as the family jumped to their feet, calling for help. But there was no help. The house felt as if it was sealed off from the world outside. The phone lines were dead. The doors wouldn't open. "We have to leave," James shouted. But even as he tried to move toward the door, he found himself rooted to the spot. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and the weight of it kept him trapped. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against them as if the house itself were alive. Then they saw it. The harvest. From the center of the room, the shadows shifted and formed a shape. A tall figure, draped in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a hood, emerged from the darkness. The scent of decaying earth filled the room, and its voice, low and ancient, rang out like a distant bell. "The debt has come due," the voice intoned, sending shivers through their spines. It wasn't one voice, but many, a chorus of whispers that echoed through the room. "For the blood of the harvest, you will pay." The family recoiled in horror. It was the spirit of the harvest, an ancient force tied to the land, bound by a pact made long ago by William Hawthorne. The family had forgotten, or perhaps never known, that their patriarch had made a deal with a dark entity, promising the blood of his descendants to ensure the prosperity of the estate, the harvest, in exchange for their blood. William had never told them. None of them knew what he had sacrificed until it was too late. One by one, the guests began to fall. The spirit moved among them, its unseen hand claiming life after life. The air grew thick with the scent of rot and earth as the last of the family members, terror-stricken and helpless, tried to escape. But the house would not let them. They were bound to the estate, just as William had been before them. In the end, there was nothing left but a table covered in blood, the remains of the harvest still glistening under the flickering light of the dying fire. And as the last of them succumbed to the entity's wrath, the house stood silent once more, waiting for the next Thanksgiving, when the harvest would call again. Story number 2, A Feast of Souls. The evening air was cold and crisp as the Fitzgerald family arrived at the historical inn nestled in the rolling hills of New England. It was the perfect place to gather, they thought. A quaint, rustic retreat far from the pressures of city life. The inn, built in the 1700s, had a charm about it, though it seemed as if time itself had forgotten to touch its dark, weathered exterior. It was Thanksgiving Eve, and the relatives hadn't seen each other in years. The invitation to spend the holiday together, sent by Thomas Fitzgerald, the eldest cousin, had been unexpected, but it was an attempt to heal old wounds. The once close-knit family had drifted apart after a series of misunderstandings and resentments. But perhaps, Thomas had thought, the shared history of their ancestors could unite them once more. As they filed into the inn's grand entryway, they were greeted by the warm glow of a fire in the hearth. The scent of spiced wine and roasted meats wafted from the kitchen, filling the air with promises of a hearty meal. Yet, something about the atmosphere didn't feel quite right. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that lingered like a waiting breath. "We're finally here," said Margaret Fitzgerald, Thomas's sister, trying to break the tension as she looked around the entryway. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" the others murmured in agreement, though they seemed more preoccupied with the inn's shadowy corners than the warmth of its hospitality. The old wooden beams creaked under the weight of the years, and the floorboards groaned as though the house itself were stretching, waking from a long sleep. Dinner was prepared, and the family gathered around the grand dining table, which had been set with antique china and silver. The flickering candlelight cast elongated shadows that danced across the walls, making the room feel as though it were filled with hidden eyes. Yet, for all its unsettling features, the inn had been quiet. Too quiet. As the evening wore on, the conversations grew more strained. They spoke of their childhoods, of people long gone, and of the years they had lost touch. But the cracks in their relationships were still there, hovering just beneath the surface. Thomas, who had always been the quiet, brooding figure of the family, seemed more distant than usual. His eyes were dark, almost fevered, as though something weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that the first strange occurrence happened. Margaret, who had been seated near the window, noticed the candlelight flicker, but it wasn't the wind. The room seemed to shift with the movement of the shadows, as if something were passing through the walls. A cold draft swept over the table, making everyone shiver, though the hearth should have kept the room warm. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. The door to the cellar opened slowly, without a sound, revealing the dark staircase that led down to the inn's lower chambers. Nobody had gone near it all evening, yet the door was ajar, as though inviting someone, or something, inside. "Thomas?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did you?" But Thomas didn't respond. He sat frozen in his chair, his gaze fixed on the door, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. His lips parted as if he were about to speak, but no words came. The atmosphere in the room thickened, growing heavier. The smell of roasted meat, once comforting, turned rancid in their nostrils, a bitter scent that seemed to seep from the very walls. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, stretching unnaturally. The fire in the hearth crackled ominously, its orange glow now tinged with an unsettling greenish hue. "Something's wrong," said James, Margaret's husband, his voice tight with fear. "What is this place?" Thomas finally stood, his movements stiff. "I never wanted you to know," he said, his voice hoarse, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "But you have to understand, this inn, this house, it isn't just old, it's cursed." The others exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to believe. But Thomas's face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror they had never seen before. "This was the site of a ritual," he continued, his voice quivering. "A long time ago, when this inn was a gathering place for travelers, it was also used for something much darker. The original owners, they were part of a cult. They believed that by consuming the souls of the dead, they could live forever. They made a pact with a dark entity that would grant them immortality in exchange for the souls of the living. The first Thanksgiving held here was nothing but a sacrifice, a feast of souls." The family stared at him, disbelief painted on their faces. But Thomas's expression was grave. "The ritual didn't stop," he whispered. "It never stopped. Over the years, each generation of the Fitzgerald family has been bound to it. Every year, the ritual is repeated, and those who stay here become part of it." Suddenly, the room seemed to tremble. The air thickened even more, pressing in on them from all sides. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and then, as if responding to some unseen force, the door to the cellar swung open wider. From below, a low, guttural sound echoed like the growl of some ancient beast. The floor vibrated underfoot, and the family members gasped as the shadows in the room began to shift, contorting into twisted shapes. "We need to leave," James said, panic rising in his voice. He reached for the door, but as he stepped forward, the candle flames flared wildly, casting the room in stark, unnatural light. From the cellar, something stirred, something old, something hungry. The spirit of the ritual's originator had awoken, and it sought new souls to consume. One by one, the Fitzgerald family members felt a cold, creeping sensation at the back of their throats, as though invisible fingers were choking the life from them. The shadows around the room deepened, their shapes becoming grotesque, pulling at their very souls. Margaret, paralyzed with fear, could only watch as the darkness crept closer, and the horrifying realization hit her. This was the feast. They were the meal. The last thing she heard before the world went dark was a soft, raspy voice, echoing from the shadows. "The feast has begun." And in the dark, the souls of the Fitzgerald family were consumed, just as those before them had been. The inn stood silent once more, its walls now thicker with the weight of its unholy pact, waiting for the next gathering to begin. Story number 3. The Ghost of Pilgrim's Past. The small town of Ashford was nestled deep in the heart of New England, a quiet place where the scent of pine and earth mixed with the crisp chill of autumn air. A group of old friends, eager to reconnect and escape the rush of their busy lives, decided to rent a farmhouse for Thanksgiving. It was a charming place, the kind of house that seemed to whisper secrets in the breeze. The farmhouse, however, had a history, one the group of friends did not know when they first arrived. The house had stood for centuries, built atop the remains of an old Pilgrim settlement from the 1600s. Over time, the land had changed hands, but it was said that the spirits of the settlers never truly left. The locals spoke of strange happenings in the area, but the friends, more interested in their reunion than in any ghost stories, dismissed the talk as mere superstition. As the group settled into the house, it felt like a scene out of a painting. The wood stove crackling softly, the scent of fresh-baked bread filling the air, and a feeling of peace that settled over them. They gathered in the large, rustic kitchen, unpacking the traditional Thanksgiving dinner ingredients: turkey, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and pies. The atmosphere felt cozy, and the familiar warmth of friendship made the place feel like home. But there was something else, something that they couldn't quite place. Megan, the most superstitious of the group, had felt it first. The chill in the air had come on so suddenly, she thought the wind had somehow crept in through an open window. But when she looked, all the windows were shut. She shrugged it off, assuming it was just the house settling. But it didn't go away. As they began preparing the meal, odd things began to happen. Dishes rattled without reason. The flickering candle flames seemed to cast shadows that danced unnaturally, and strange, faint whispers echoed through the hallways. But it wasn't until they began to carve the turkey that the true horror revealed itself. The whispers turned into voices. Low at first, barely audible, they were words that didn't quite make sense. Then, they grew clearer. "Sacrifice," a voice hissed from the shadows. Everyone stopped what they were doing, turning toward the source of the voice. The kitchen was still, too still, and the air was thick with an unease none of them could shake. "Did you hear that?" Ben asked, his face pale as he looked around. "Probably just the wind," Lisa replied, but her voice was shaky. She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. A bone-chilling cold seeped into the walls, creeping up their spines. It felt as though something was watching them. A draft fluttered the curtains by the window, but when they turned to look, the window was closed tight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Sacrifice. The feast is ours." The friends, now on edge, tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the room was palpable. The flickering candles cast strange shadows on the walls, shadows that moved, shifted, and grew as if they had lives of their own. Then, the kitchen door slammed shut, rattling the wooden frame as if someone, or something, had thrown it with great force. Ben reached for the door, his hand trembling, but when he turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. "We need to leave," Megan said urgently, her voice filled with panic. "This place is cursed. These are the spirits of the Pilgrims, I'm telling you." Just as she spoke, the walls groaned, as though they were being pressed from within, and a cold wind howled through the cracks. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even lower. That's when the apparition appeared. A shadow in the shape of a figure, tall, gaunt, and dressed in the ragged clothing of a pilgrim, stepped into the room. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its presence was enough to paralyze the group with fear. "It is time," the voice intoned, sounding like the distant echoes of a long-dead soul. "The harvest is upon us. The feast is ours." The spirit's voice seemed to reverberate in their bones, and the room seemed to grow colder still. The windows suddenly slammed open, and the wind howled into the room, stirring the candles and sending the freshly prepared meal tumbling from the table. Another shadow appeared, then another, each figure wearing the same tattered pilgrim clothing, their faces hidden in the darkness. They surrounded the group, their whispers turning into chants, growing louder and louder until it became deafening. "Sacrifice. The feast is ours." One of the figures reached out, its skeletal hand stretching toward the turkey on the table. The friends tried to back away, but they were frozen, rooted to the spot by the oppressive weight of the spirits. The air was so thick now, it felt like they were choking on it. "Do you see what you have disturbed?" the first pilgrim spirit hissed. "This land, this feast, belongs to us. The harvest, the souls, the blood, all of it is ours." The friends could barely breathe, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on them, suffocating them. There was no way out. The spirits of the pilgrims had returned to claim what they were owed. In a panic, they tried to escape, but the door wouldn't open. The shadows grew more solid, more real, closing in on them like a thick fog. The voices were everywhere now, chanting their demands, their hunger. As the first of the spirits reached out to claim them, the friends realized the terrible truth. They had become part of the feast. The next morning, the farmhouse was eerily quiet. The table, once set with food, was now empty. The turkey, the cranberry sauce, and the pies were gone. The house stood silent, waiting, its ancient curse satisfied, for now. The friends had vanished without a trace, their fates sealed in the restless hands of the pilgrims, and the spirits waited for the next Thanksgiving, when they would rise once more, hungry for more souls to claim. Story number 4. The Cranberry Curse. It had been years since Lily had returned to her childhood home, a small farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills of Maine. The road leading to the property was long and winding, framed by towering trees whose branches seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. The house, a sturdy old building with a wraparound porch and faded white shutters, had always been a sanctuary to her, filled with warmth and the aroma of home-cooked meals. But this time, something was different. As she drove up the dirt road, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that the place had changed in ways she couldn't quite describe. It was Thanksgiving, and she had come back to spend the holiday with her family, her parents, her 2 brothers, and her aunt, just like old times. The thought of gathering around the table again brought her a strange sense of nostalgia, mixed with a slight unease she couldn't explain. When she arrived, she was greeted by her father, Hank, who looked older than she remembered. His once broad shoulders now hunched slightly, and his face was etched with lines of worry. Her mother, Sarah, smiled warmly, though her eyes carried a shadow of something darker, something Lily had never seen before. "Welcome home, sweetheart," her mother said as she embraced her. But there was an unfamiliar stiffness in her hug, as if she were holding something back. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Lily asked quietly, sensing the tension in the air. Her mother hesitated, glancing at her father before answering. "It's nothing, just the weather and the crops." Lily frowned. The farm had always been prosperous, especially their cranberry crop, which was renowned throughout the region. But as she glanced toward the fields behind the house, she noticed the cranberry vines looked different, twisted, withered, as though they hadn't been tended to in years. The once healthy red berries, which had always seemed to glisten in the sunlight, were now dark and shriveled, hanging like dried husks from the vines. The air smelled faintly of rot, but Lily tried to push the thought away. It had been a tough year, and maybe the crops hadn't fared well. Still, something didn't sit right. The family gathered around the dinner table later that evening, the room filled with the familiar smells of roast turkey, stuffing, and the all-important cranberry sauce. But as Lily took her first bite, she felt a jolt of discomfort. The cranberry sauce was bitter, far too bitter. She put her fork down, trying to mask her reaction. "What's wrong, sweetie?" her father asked, looking concerned. "It's just different," she said, trying to sound casual. But she couldn't stop the taste from lingering on her tongue. Sharp, sour, like something rotting from the inside. Her brothers didn't seem to notice, but her mother's face had tightened the moment Lily mentioned it. As the meal continued, the house seemed to grow colder, the once cozy warmth turning oppressive. The lights flickered in the dining room, casting eerie shadows across the table. Lily's mother kept glancing toward the window, her eyes darting nervously, and her father grew more distant with each passing minute, his hands clenched tightly around his glass of wine. Then the whispers began. At first, they were so soft that Lily thought it was just the wind outside. But then the voices grew louder, too loud to be dismissed. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the house. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the conversation at the table, but the words were clear now. Sacrifice. Return what's ours. Lily felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned toward her mother, who was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. "What is that?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. Her father didn't answer. Instead, he stood up abruptly, his face twisted with a strange expression of fear and guilt. He began to speak, but his words came out in an unrecognizable jumble. His voice was no longer his own. It sounded distant, foreign, as if he were channeling something from another time. Lily stood quickly, backing away from the table. The whispers were growing louder, rising to a deafening crescendo. "What's happening? What's wrong with you?" Her mother stood too, her face expressionless. "We didn't want you to know," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "We never wanted you to find out." Lily was about to say something when she felt a chill rush through the room. The temperature seemed to drop drastically in a matter of seconds. The room flickered, and then the floor beneath them seemed to tremble. The cranberry sauce in the bowls began to bubble, as though it were boiling in the cold air. The air thickened, as though something was pressing in from all sides. Her mother's voice was almost a whisper now, but the words were clear. "It's been passed down for generations, the curse of the cranberry." Lily looked at her in confusion. "Curse? What do you mean?" Her father, still holding his wine glass, turned slowly toward her. His eyes were no longer his own. They were black, empty, like a void. "The crop," he said, in a voice that wasn't his. "The land demands its price. Every year the harvest grows bitterer, the spirits angrier, and every year we are forced to pay with the blood of our own." The house seemed to groan, and Lily's feet became rooted to the spot, as if the very earth beneath her was pulling her down. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were alive, pushing in on her. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, coiling around her like tendrils, closing in with an unnatural hunger. "No," Lily whispered, backing away. "No, this can't be true." Her mother reached out a hand, her face expressionless, but her eyes were filled with an ancient sorrow. "You were always meant to take your place," she said softly. "The bloodline demands it. You are the one who must stop it." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder, the words clearer. Sacrifice. Return what's ours. She turned and ran, bursting through the front door and into the night. The air outside was still and heavy, the sky dark and oppressive. Behind her, she heard her family's voices, now hollow and distant, calling her name. But it was too late. The curse had already taken root, and it was hungry for her. In the distance, the cranberry fields were glowing, the tainted berries now shining like blood-red jewels under the full moon. As Lily stared at them, she realized the truth. The land would never let her go. And now, she too was bound to the curse of the cranberries, just as her family had been for generations. The harvest would always demand its price. Story number 5. The Black Turkey. The village of Hemlock Hollow had always been a place where time seemed to move differently. Nestled in the dense woods of New England, it was the kind of town people drove through without ever stopping. But for those who lived there, it was home. A quiet place where strange things often went unnoticed. That's how it had always been for the Richardson family. Every Thanksgiving, the family gathered at the old farmhouse, a creaking structure that seemed to sag under the weight of history. The farmhouse had belonged to Thomas and Eleanor Richardson for decades. They were an elderly couple, quiet and reserved, known to the town for their odd ways. They rarely left the house, and it was said that their farm grew strange crops, the likes of which no one else could cultivate. Among these, though, the most unusual was the breed of turkey they raised. Large, dark birds with feathers so black they seemed to absorb the light around them. This year, as usual, the family had gathered for the holiday dinner. Thomas and Eleanor's children and grandchildren, along with a few close friends, filled the long wooden dining table, the aroma of roasting turkey filling the air. The turkey, however, was different this time. Its feathers were darker than usual, almost shimmering with an unnatural sheen. Eleanor had prepared it with a practiced hand, but something about the bird felt wrong, as if it wasn't meant to be eaten. "The turkey's looking a bit odd, don't you think?" Claire, Thomas's daughter, whispered to her brother, Aaron, as they watched Eleanor carve the bird with deliberate care. The dark feathers, glistening with fat, were like a shadow of something forgotten. The sharp scent of the meat was thick, almost metallic, as it filled the room. Aaron laughed, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's just a turkey, Claire. Stop imagining things." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. The bird's dark eyes seemed to gleam as Eleanor placed the platter in the center of the table. The guests, some familiar and some unfamiliar, took their seats, oblivious to the creeping unease that had settled over the room. As the meal began, the family dug into the food, the clinking of silverware filling the heavy silence. At first, everything seemed normal, but as the evening wore on, things began to shift. Claire noticed the first oddity when her husband, Greg, excused himself to use the bathroom. He had been feeling ill for a while, clutching his stomach in discomfort. Moments later, a loud crash came from the hall, the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. The guests rushed to the hallway to find Greg sprawled on the ground, unconscious, his face pale and contorted in pain. Eleanor, who had been standing near the door, muttered something under her breath, a low, strange chant, before turning back to the dinner table. Claire's heart raced as she knelt beside Greg, checking for signs of life. He was breathing, but barely, his skin clammy. "Shouldn't we take him to the hospital?" Claire asked, her voice rising in panic. Thomas, with his gray eyes fixed firmly on the turkey, shook his head. "Leave him. He's already where he needs to be." The words hung in the air, strange and final. Claire stood up, her mind spinning, but before she could speak, a cry came from the other end of the table. It was Eleanor's sister, June, who had been sitting quietly with her husband, Henry. June had suddenly stopped eating, her face twisting in agony. Her hand clutched her throat as she gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening to her?" Claire shouted, But there was no answer. June's body convulsed, her back arching unnaturally, and then she collapsed, lifeless, onto the table. The turkey, now half-eaten, sat untouched by the others, its dark eyes gleaming as if it were watching them. Thomas stood up slowly, his face grim. "It's begun," he said in a voice that sounded far older than his years. "The curse of the turkey." "What do you mean?" Aaron demanded, his voice shaking. "What's happening to our family?" Thomas turned his haunted gaze toward the bird. "The turkey we raise isn't just a bird. It's the vessel of something darker. An ancestor of ours, a man who once served a cruel master. His spirit, bound to this bird, returns each year to collect what is owed to him." Aaron took a step back, his hand trembling as he reached for the wine glass in front of him. This is insane. A cursed turkey? "It is not the turkey itself, but the spirit within it," Thomas continued. "A spirit of vengeance, one that was wronged in life and now demands payment. With each year, the curse grows stronger. It begins small, with sickness, with strange happenings, but by the end of the night, it will claim its price." Claire backed away from the table, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to understand, had to know how to stop it. "What do we do?" she asked, voice strained. "How do we stop it?" Thomas glanced at the turkey. "The curse can only be broken by offering the spirit something more than it demands, a soul willing to give itself up. But the one who offers must be connected to the bloodline." At that moment, Claire understood. The turkey, with its black feathers and gleaming eyes, was more than a meal. It was a keeper of souls, drawing from the blood of the family itself. And it was hungry. As the night dragged on, more family members began to succumb to the bird's curse, their bodies collapsing, one by one, to the floor. It was clear that only by offering someone willing to sacrifice themselves could the curse be stopped. But there was one more twist. Claire was the one the spirit wanted. She was the last of the bloodline connected to the ancestor who had first bound himself to the turkey. As the final family member fell, Claire stood alone, trembling, as the turkey's dark eyes gleamed at her with unmistakable hunger. And then, with a final, deep breath, she understood the price of her lineage. To stop the curse, she had to feed the spirit what it truly craved. And as she approached the table, she knew that her sacrifice was the only way to end the nightmare. She would become part of the curse, a part of the bird forevermore. With that, the turkey's gleaming eyes finally closed, its hunger sated. But for Claire, the nightmare was only just beginning. Story number 6, The Harvest Moon's Price. The Blackwood family's ancestral home stood on a sprawling estate, surrounded by thick forests and fields of golden wheat. The house, an imposing Victorian mansion, had seen generations of Blackwoods come and go, each adding to its history, its wealth, and its dark secrets. The family had always been known for their prosperity, but few were aware of the price they paid for it. This Thanksgiving, like so many before, the Blackwoods gathered for their holiday feast. The entire extended family had come together, filling the grand dining room with laughter, the clinking of glasses and the scent of turkey roasting in the oven. Outside, the full harvest moon hung low in the sky, casting a strange, eerie light across the land. It was a moon that seemed to watch them, judging, waiting. The patriarch of the family, Edward Blackwood, stood at the head of the table, his sharp eyes gleaming with pride as he raised a glass to the gathered relatives. "To another year of prosperity," he said, his voice steady and commanding. The others raised their glasses, the clink of crystal mingling with the soft murmur of approval. But as the evening wore on, something began to feel off. There was an unease in the air, a growing tension that none of the family members could ignore. The laughter seemed hollow, the joy forced, as though the weight of some unseen presence loomed over them. Alice Blackwood, Edward's daughter, could feel it most keenly. She had always been sensitive to the strange atmosphere that surrounded their home, the thick silence that would sometimes settle over the house in the dead of night. This time, it was different. She had been hearing whispers, faint, distant voices that seemed to be calling her. It wasn't the first time she'd experienced such things, but it was the first time she felt the urgency of it, the need to understand what was happening. At dinner, she watched her father as he carved the turkey with practiced ease. His face was calm, but his eyes were distant, as if he were lost in thought, or perhaps lost in something far worse. The food tasted strange that evening, too. The turkey, roasted to perfection, was drier than usual, and the wine, though expensive, had a bitter aftertaste. Alice wasn't the only one who noticed. Her cousin, Martin, had been pacing around the house nervously all evening. He had stopped eating and kept glancing toward the windows, his eyes darting toward the distant fields where the harvest moon hung high in the sky. He was fidgeting with his cufflinks as though unable to settle. "Is everything all right, Martin?" Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his face pale. "Something's wrong. I can't explain it. Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" Alice frowned. "You're just tired. It's the moonlight, it's making everything seem strange," but Martin shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It's something in the air. It's the house. There's something we don't know." Alice turned her gaze toward the grand portrait of her great-great-grandfather, Charles Blackwood, that hung above the fireplace. He had been the first to build this house, the one who had made the family's fortune. But Alice knew the rumors, whispers passed down through generations, that Charles had made a terrible bargain with a dark force, a bargain that had ensured the family's wealth but had come with a price: the harvest moon, the blood sacrifice. The evening grew late, and the family moved to the sitting room. The house seemed colder now, the shadows in the corners deeper, more oppressive. The whispers in Alice's mind grew louder. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that had been set in motion long ago. As the clock struck midnight, Edward stood and raised his glass again. His voice was low, almost reverent. "It is time." The room fell silent. Everyone looked toward him, but it was clear that they all knew what he meant. They had all heard the stories, the warnings that had been passed down from their ancestors, the ritual, the harvest moon, the price. Alice felt a chill run through her as she looked around the room. Her family, the ones she had known all her life, were no longer the same. Their faces, though familiar, seemed strange, almost unnatural, as though they were somehow different from the people she had once known. They were all waiting for her father's command. "We have prospered for centuries," Edward continued, "but there is always a price. Tonight, the ritual must be completed. The harvest moon demands its due." Alice's breath caught in her throat as she realized the terrible truth. The ritual had begun, and one of the family, must be chosen to fulfill the sacrifice. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had heard the stories. The ritual demanded a blood sacrifice from the Blackwood bloodline, a life to ensure the family's prosperity for another year. The harvest moon rose high in the sky, and the price must be paid. "I will do it," Martin said suddenly, his voice filled with resolve. He had moved to stand beside Edward, his eyes cold and unblinking. Alice's heart dropped. "No, Martin." But Martin raised his hand, cutting her off. "It must be done. It's the only way." Her father nodded, his face impassive. "Yes, the sacrifice must be made." Before Alice could protest, the door to the study opened, and a cold wind swept through the room. The shadows seemed to deepen, and the air became thick with the weight of something ancient, something powerful. Martin stepped forward, his face now set in grim determination. With a final, chilling glance toward Alice, he walked into the darkness of the study, where the harvest moon's light bathed the room in an eerie glow. Alice stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, as the sound of footsteps faded into the silence. The price had been paid. The harvest moon's demands had been fulfilled, and the Blackwood family would prosper for another year. But the house, now empty and silent, held something darker, a shadow that would wait, as it always had, for the next harvest moon. Story number 7. Feast of the Forgotten. The old plantation house stood at the edge of the small town of Waverly, its dark silhouette casting a shadow over the fields that stretched out into the night. For generations, the Davis family had celebrated Thanksgiving in the house, with its towering columns and antique furniture. The house had always felt like a relic from a forgotten past, a place where time stood still. It was the perfect setting for a family reunion, a place to gather and remember, though few truly knew the history of the land beneath their feet. This year, the Davis family had come together again, as they had for so many Thanksgivings before. The dining room was filled with the scent of roasting turkey, freshly baked pies, and the warm glow of candles flickering on the table. Family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, sat around the long wooden table, exchanging stories and laughter as the evening wore on. But something felt different this time. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that no one could quite explain. The house seemed to creak and groan under its weight, as if it were alive, as if it had been waiting for something. It was Claire, the youngest of the family, who found it. She had been exploring the dusty corners of the house, hoping to escape the noise of the gathering for a few moments of peace. Her fingers traced the edges of old bookshelves, some of the family's oldest relics, until her hand brushed against something soft. A letter, yellowed with age, wedged between two large books. She pulled it out carefully, intrigued by its age and the faded writing on the front. It was addressed to the head of the Davis family at the time, her great-great-great-grandfather Samuel Davis. Claire's curiosity got the best of her, and she opened the letter. The words were written in an elegant hand, though the ink had begun to fade. The letter spoke of something horrifying, something buried in the past that Claire had never heard of before. The sacrifice must be made. The harvest calls for blood. The soul of the innocent will ensure prosperity for another year. The letter went on to explain that her great-great-great-grandfather had, in the name of Thanksgiving, killed an innocent person, a young woman who had wandered too close to the plantation. The letter was filled with dark praise for the ritual, confirming that the family had been bound to the land through bloodshed. The writer spoke of the spirit of the harvest, and how it demanded the blood of the innocent each year to ensure the prosperity of the family. Claire's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her. She tried to dismiss the thoughts that formed in her mind, but the words haunted her. She had to tell someone. Returning to the dining room, she handed the letter to her father, David, the current head of the family. His face grew pale as he read the letter. The room fell silent as he finished, his hands trembling as he placed the letter back on the table. "We have to leave," Claire said urgently. "The letter, it says—" "I know what it says," David interrupted, his voice hollow. "But it's just a story, a part of the past. Something that happened long before we were born. This house is old, Claire. It holds on to things." But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The weight in the air had grown heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, and the candle flames flickered as if disturbed by an unseen breeze. Suddenly, A voice came from the far end of the table, one that had been silent through the entire evening. "I don't think it's just a story," said her cousin Rachel, her voice trembling. She was holding something in her hands, an old photograph, faded with age. "This woman, she looks like me." Rachel placed the photograph on the table for everyone to see. It was a picture of a young woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes standing by the plantation house. Her eyes, though captured in black and white, seemed to shine with an unsettling intensity. The resemblance to Rachel was uncanny. The room went cold. "Who is she?" Rachel whispered, her fingers tracing the edges of the photo. Claire's mind raced. She remembered the letter, the innocent blood, the harvest. And now this photo, a woman who looked strikingly like Rachel. It could not be a coincidence. "Rachel, do you know who she is?" Claire asked, her voice shaky. Rachel shook her head, her face pale. "No, but I've seen her before, in dreams. She watches me, she calls to me." A chill swept through the room. The atmosphere had shifted, and it was clear that something was waking up in the house. The air seemed to hum with energy, heavy and oppressive. The shadows in the corners seemed to move. Then, the door to the dining room slammed shut, as if caught by a gust of wind. The family jumped, looking toward the door. From the dark hallway came a low, drawn-out whisper. "Blood." It was a voice, but it wasn't human. It was the sound of something ancient, something trapped in the house, bound to it by a terrible ritual. The family turned to each other, panic spreading through them. The whispers grew louder. "Blood! Blood!" The room grew colder. The air grew thick with the scent of decay. The family looked around, but no one could see where the voice was coming from. And then they saw it, the reflection in the mirror on the far wall. It wasn't their own faces staring back at them. It was the face of the woman from the photograph. She stepped out of the mirror, her eyes filled with rage. The room froze, the temperature plummeting as she advanced toward them. Rachel screamed, stepping back. "What is this? Who are you?" The woman in the mirror raised her hand, pointing directly at Rachel. "You are mine," she said in a voice that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Claire turned to her father. "We have to stop this. The ritual, the sacrifice, it's all true. The spirit wants blood, and it's connected to Rachel. She's the one who—" Before she could finish, the woman's voice echoed again. "The price must be paid. The harvest demands its sacrifice." The room trembled, and the air grew thick with a sense of doom. In the midst of the chaos, Claire realized the terrible truth. The spirit of the woman had been waiting all these years, bound to the family by the bloodshed of their ancestors. And now, Rachel, unwittingly related to the murderer, was the one who would fulfill the curse. But there was no escaping the price. The harvest would always demand its due. As the spirit closed in on Rachel, the room was filled with darkness, and the family was left to face the cost of their past. The Feast of the Forgotten. Story number 8. The Feast of Echoes. The town of Ashford was known for its grand Thanksgiving celebrations. Each year, the entire town gathered at the same time, in the same place, the town hall, where long tables were set with the same food, the same decorations, and the same familiar faces. It was a tradition that had been passed down through generations, a feast to mark the harvest, and to give thanks for another year of prosperity. But there was something unsettling about Ashford's Thanksgiving. Something none of the townspeople could quite explain, but they felt it every year, creeping in as the day went on. It wasn't until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, that the true nature of the day began to unfold. This year, as with every year before it, the preparations began early. The streets of Ashford were lined with families bringing pies and casseroles, carrying them into the town hall where the feast would take place. Children ran through the streets with laughter, chasing each other as the adults set the long tables. It was all familiar, and yet, as the clock ticked closer to dinner, an unsettling feeling began to settle over the people. Martha Thompson, one of the town's older residents, sat by the window of her small house, watching the preparations outside. She had been attending the town's Thanksgiving feast for as long as she could remember, though she couldn't recall how many years that was. Her memory felt foggy, like a dream she couldn't fully wake up from. She had grown older, certainly, but time seemed to blur in Ashford. One year blended into the next, and the faces at the table, her friends, her family, seemed strangely unchanging, like photographs in a frame that refused to fade. It wasn't until she arrived at the town hall that the feeling intensified. The moment she stepped through the door, she saw it. The same people, the same table, the same decorations. It was as if time had bent back on itself, and though she tried to brush it aside, a faint sense of déjà vu gripped her. Martha sat at the table with the others, her plate filled with turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and the familiar green beans. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a bite, the flavors rich and warm, comforting in their consistency. But something felt wrong. She couldn't remember what had happened in the year before, or the one before that. But it seemed as though this exact moment, this exact meal, had happened countless times before. As the dinner progressed, the conversation flowed just as it always did. The same small talk, the same jokes, the same laughter that echoed through the hall. But the people seemed distant somehow, like they were merely going through the motions. Their eyes were wide with confusion, yet they did not question it. They had done this so many times before. Haven't they? Then, just as the evening wore on, a strange thing happened. One by one, the guests began to look at each other with a mixture of realization and fear. They began to speak, slowly at first, as though they were waking from a long slumber. "Hasn't this happened before?" someone asked, their voice shaking. "I don't know," another answered, staring at their plate, their hands clenched tightly around their fork. "But it feels so familiar." Martha's heart skipped a beat. She was not alone in her confusion. The others had begun to notice it too, the nagging feeling that they had experienced this exact moment before. She had to ask, she had to know. "Why does it feel like we've been here before?" she asked aloud, her voice hoarse with fear. The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her, their faces pale, their eyes wide with growing dread. Then, one of the men at the end of the table, James, the town's mayor, stood up, his face grim. "I don't know how to explain it," he said, his voice trembling. "But this isn't the first time. It can't be." Martha stood as well, feeling a cold shiver creep up her spine. She had heard rumors over the years, whispered secrets about Ashford. They said the town had a curse that forced them to relive the same Thanksgiving every year, that no matter how much time passed, they were bound to repeat the same meal, the same faces, the same conversation. But Martha had never believed the stories. She had thought them to be nothing more than ghost stories told to children. But now, standing in the dim light of the town hall, she knew it was true. The curse was real, and the price of it was far worse than she could have imagined. The whispers grew louder, voices overlapping as everyone began to speak at once. "We're trapped," one woman cried. "This is the same as last year and the year before." A man, his hands trembling, stood from his seat and backed away from the table. "If this keeps happening, if we keep doing the same thing every year, then why can't we remember? Why can't we change anything?" Then, as if in response to the question, The lights flickered. The air in the room grew colder. And in that moment, the doors to the town hall slammed shut. A voice echoed in the silence, cold and hollow, as if coming from deep within the walls themselves. "Each year, the feast must be repeated," the voice intoned. "Each year, a life must be given." Everyone in the room froze. No one moved, no one spoke. The meaning of the words hung heavy in the air like a weight that no one could escape. The townspeople had known this. It was a part of them, a part of the curse. Every year, someone had to die to keep the cycle going, to ensure the town's prosperity, to keep the feast alive. The truth dawned on them all at once. There was no escaping it. The same dinner, the same faces, the same ritual. It was an endless cycle, a cycle that demanded a sacrifice to continue. And this year, the price would be paid again. Martha, her heart pounding in her chest, turned to the others. Who will it be?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. And in that moment she realized the answer had always been there. The price would be paid by someone who had no memory of the past, someone who had come to the town unaware, someone who would never leave. The table went silent as the realization sank in. And as the feast continued, the cycle began anew. Story number 9. Turkey Dinner. The Langford family had never been wealthy. They lived in a small, cramped house on the outskirts of town, struggling to make ends meet. But as Thanksgiving approached, they were given an unexpected invitation. A chance to join the wealthy and reclusive Davis family at their sprawling estate for a traditional holiday dinner. For Sarah Langford, it was an opportunity she could hardly turn down. A meal like this, one prepared by the famous chefs that worked for the Davis family, was something she could only dream of. When Sarah, her husband Daniel, and their 2 children arrived at the Davis estate, they were struck by the grandeur of it all. The house loomed before them, its windows glowing with warmth and gold, and the front door opened to reveal a grand foyer filled with antique furniture and towering chandeliers. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine, and the large dining table was already set for a feast. Everything about the place felt out of their league, but the Davis family had welcomed them with open arms. Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She was grateful for the meal, but something about the ostentation of the estate felt wrong. As they sat down at the table, the conversation flowed easily at first. Polite exchanges about the weather, about how beautiful the house was, about how lucky they all were to be together for Thanksgiving. But as soon as the turkey arrived, placed at the center of the table with an ornate silver platter, the atmosphere changed. The bird was unlike any Sarah had ever seen. It was enormous, its skin a deep, almost unnatural shade of dark brown, gleaming in the candlelight as if it had been coated in some sort of varnish. The turkey's eyes, though cooked and stuffed, seemed to glimmer in an unsettling way, too lifelike. And its smell, though rich with the usual scent of roasted meat, carried an undertone that Sarah couldn't quite place. It was metallic, almost like blood. "Wow, that's one big bird," Daniel commented, trying to lighten the mood. But Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her stomach. The turkey seemed almost too perfect, too sinister. The Davis family served the turkey, carving it with a precision that made Sarah uneasy. The first bite she took felt strangely heavy in her mouth. It was delicious, of course, too delicious. But there was something in it that made her skin crawl. As she chewed, the world around her seemed to blur. Suddenly, her vision darkened, and a flash of vivid images flooded her mind. She saw a room she didn't recognize. Large, dark, and filled with men and women who looked strangely out of place in their old-fashioned clothes. A loud crash echoed in her ears, followed by frantic voices. Then, blood. The floor was covered in blood, and the people in the room were screaming, pleading for their lives. She saw a woman, pale and horrified, her hands bound, and then the knife. Sarah gasped, clutching her chest as she snapped back to the present, her fork still in her hand. Her heart was racing, her breath shallow. "Are you all right, Sarah?" Mrs. Davis asked, her voice smooth and concerned, but there was something off about her smile, something too perfect. I don't know," Sarah stammered, feeling disoriented. I think I need some air." But before she could stand, another vision swept over her. She was no longer at the dinner table. She was in the same room as before, the same dark room surrounded by shadows. The blood was thicker now, pooling around the floor. The woman from before was there, kneeling on the cold stone, her face twisted in pain, her cries echoing in Sarah's ears. The knife had been raised, and she could see the glint of the blade as it descended, plunging deep into the woman's chest. And then Sarah saw the turkey again, perched on the table, eyes gleaming as if it had watched it all happen. She was jolted back to the present once more, her body trembling with fear. She looked around the table, seeing the others in a daze. Daniel was staring at his plate, his face pale, his mouth slightly open as if he were caught in a trance. The children, too, were silent, their eyes wide with fear, as though they had seen something in the room that shouldn't be there. "Mom, what's happening?" her daughter Lily whispered, her voice shaking. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but her throat tightened. The room seemed to stretch before her, and she could feel the oppressive weight of something ancient in the air. She turned to the Davis family, trying to understand what was happening. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Davis gave her a small, polite smile. "It's just the turkey," she said softly, her eyes glinting with something unreadable. "It has a way of affecting people. It helps us remember." "Remember what?" Sarah's voice was a hoarse whisper, panic rising in her chest. The visions from her mind felt too real, too vivid. The blood, the screams, the knife. "It helps you remember the price," Mr. Davis said from the other end of the table, his voice flat and cold. The room seemed to grow colder. Sarah's heart pounded as she understood the meaning behind the words. The turkey, the perfect unsettling bird, was not just a meal. It was tied to something darker, something ancient. The massacre she had seen was real. It had happened on this very estate long ago. And now, each year, the turkey brought those memories to life, feeding off the fear of the guests who ate it. Sarah stood up quickly, but her legs felt weak. "I need to leave. I need to get out of here." The Davis family didn't stop her. In fact, they only watched her with quiet, knowing eyes as she stumbled toward the door, the sounds of her family's disoriented murmurs fading behind her. The air outside felt strangely calm, but Sarah couldn't shake the images in her mind. The blood, the screams, the turkey. As she stepped away from the mansion and into the night, Sarah knew she had escaped the worst of it, for now. But the turkey still lay on the Davis family's table, its eyes gleaming in the darkness, waiting for the next guests to come. And the cycle would begin again. Story number 10. The Pilgrims' Plight. The Morrison family gathered as they always did for Thanksgiving, their home filled with the comforting smells of roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and warm apple pie. It was a tradition passed down for generations, a time for the family to come together and give thanks for the harvest. But this year, something felt different. There was an unease in the air that none of them could shake, though they tried to ignore it as they sat down to their feast. Thomas Morrison, the family patriarch, sat at the head of the table, his large frame looming over the rest of the family. His wife, Margaret, sat beside him, while their two children, Sarah and Jacob, and their respective spouses, Emily and John filled the rest of the seats. The table was set with all the trimmings of a traditional Thanksgiving meal, the flickering candles casting warm light across the faces of the gathered family members. As the meal began, the conversation was light. Everyone spoke of their lives. Jacob and Emily's recent move into a new home, Sarah's promotion at work, the grandkids' latest accomplishments. But all the while, an odd feeling lingered in the room, something none of them could explain. The food tasted fine, yet the atmosphere felt heavy, as though the air was thickening with each passing minute. It wasn't until the dessert was served and the last of the pumpkin pie had been cut that the first strange thing happened. The old family portrait hanging above the fireplace, the one that had been passed down for generations, began to tremble. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But then, with a loud crack, the frame rattled against the wall. Everyone looked up, startled. Thomas rose from his seat, his eyes narrowing as he approached the portrait. "What in the world?" he muttered under his breath. As he reached up to touch the frame, it seemed to shake harder, and then, inexplicably, the picture fell from the wall, crashing to the floor with a deafening thud. The room fell silent. Margaret gasped, and Sarah stood up, clutching the back of her chair. Jacob stepped forward cautiously, but it was Thomas who knelt to examine the picture. Beneath the glass, instead of the familiar family portrait, there was a different image. A faded painting of a man in old-fashioned worn clothes, his face stern and unyielding. He appeared to be standing in front of a large wooden building, with trees stretching behind him. "This isn't possible," Thomas said, his voice strained. He carefully removed the glass and the painting from the frame, revealing a note pinned to the back. It was yellowed with age, the writing faded but still legible. "The feast will bring ruin. The harvest demands blood. Those who partake in this meal will pay the price. The curse will not be undone until the blood is spilled." The words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, and he stood abruptly, turning to face his family. This can't be real. It's just some old superstition, something from the past," he said, trying to dismiss it, but his voice faltered. Emily, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "Who is this man? Why does he look so familiar?" She pointed at the figure in the painting. "Could this be one of our ancestors?" Thomas's face went pale. That's my great-great-great-grandfather. His name was William Morrison. He was one of the original settlers here." But as the words left his mouth, the room grew colder, and a strange sound filled the air. A low, eerie humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Margaret shivered, clutching her arms to her chest. "What is that sound?" Before anyone could answer, a voice, low and gravelly, echoed through the room. "The curse is upon you." The voice seemed to come from nowhere, yet it felt so real, so close. Then, as the family stared in shock, the temperature in the room dropped, the cold seeping deep into their bones. It was as if the very air had turned to ice. From the shadows of the hallway, a figure slowly materialized, a man dressed in the same tattered clothes as the one in the painting. His face, though worn with age, held a fierce and tragic determination. "I am William Morrison," the figure spoke, his voice rasping, like the crackling of dry leaves. "And your actions have awoken the curse that I set in place. You have ignored the warnings of our past." The family recoiled, but William's gaze never left them. We were desperate," he continued. "The harvest was failing, and our people were starving. So we made a pact, one that would bind our bloodline for centuries. A sacrifice was required, a life to ensure the bounty of the land." His eyes hardened. "Your ancestors chose to spill the blood of an innocent. Now that debt is owed." The family stood frozen, the weight of his words settling over them. Margaret stepped forward, her voice shaking. "What do you mean? Are you saying we're cursed?" William's eyes seemed to darken. "The harvest demands blood, and now you must pay the price for the feast that you have partaken in. You cannot escape it. The meal has already been served. You have sealed your fate." The family glanced nervously at one another, the realization dawning on them like a slow, suffocating tide. Each bite they had taken, the turkey, the stuffing, the wine, had drawn them deeper into the curse's grip. But it was too late now. The meal was already consumed. William's ghostly form stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward them. "The price must be paid, and it will be paid in blood," he intoned, his voice like the wind howling through the trees. Panic spread through the room as they realized what was happening. It wasn't just the curse that had been awakened. It was their own actions. They had unknowingly sealed their fate by partaking in the very feast that had condemned them. In that moment, the family realized the horrifying truth. There was no escaping the past, no running from the curse of their ancestors, and the harvest would demand its price.